Good morning, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Ali Naqvi. I'm the head of equities for Asia Pacific. As Brady was saying, that we live in uncertain times. For the last 7-8 years, macro factors globally have been driving the markets. And what we have tried to do every Tuesday in the AIC, that we focus on these macro issues. So our keynote panel is focused on what the global macro issues are and how do we address them. This year as well, we are focusing on those macro issues. We have broadened them. We are 5 macro issues we are going to talk about. We are going to talk about US, Europe, which traditionally we talk about China. But the last 2 topics which have come very relevant in the last 1 and 3 years are Japan and India. So we are going to talk about that as well. And we hope that we get some strong insights from these experts which we have today. I'm going to introduce all the speakers briefly, one by one, obviously, and then we'll welcome them together at the end. So on my first right is President Jose Manuel Barroso. President Barroso was the president of European Commission till October 2014. He had a 10-year stint. He had a very distinguished academic career, national political career, and then international political career. So at the academic career, he had many publications. He has been teaching at the University of Lisbon, University of Geneva, and at Georgetown University, DC as well. He joined the political party of SDP, the Democratic Party, in 1980, had different government positions from 1985 onwards, led the team to an elections victory, became the Prime Minister in 2002, and from 2002 to 2004, he was the Prime Minister of Portugal. From 2004 to 2014, he was the President of the European Commission, and as you know, obviously, the European Union and the Commission has gone through some of its toughest times in the last few years, especially in his second stint. So we are very, very honored to have him here and show and bring his insights about and convince us why we should stay bullish on European Union. The next person to President Barroso is Richard Fisher. Richard just stepped down literally on 19th of March from the Fed. He was the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He also did a stint for 10 years, from 2005 to 2015. He had a long history of public service, starting from the Carter administration in 1977. He was with the Bush administration as well in trade negotiations during the early 2000s as well. He has worked in the financial sector, has managed money as well, so he has seen both sides. He is seen as a hawk on interest rates. He has been pushing for the interest rates to go up, which, as we saw in our survey, is one of our biggest concerns as an investment community. So it will be interesting to see why he thinks interest rates should be going up, and also to get his insights in what happened last week at the FOMC, even though he was not part of the meeting, but he was at the dinner, which was his farewell dinner, I'm told. So again, welcome, Mr. Fisher. Sitting next to Mr. Fisher is Michael Pettis. Michael Pettis is the professor of finance at Gonghua Business School at Peking University. So he is a veteran of the Wall Street from 1987 to 2001, has done different jobs at the Wall Street. He is a financial expert on policy and trade and financial markets. He has applied his US experience on the Asian markets in the past few years. He is an author of 3 books. The last one is The Great Rebalancing, about policy, about conflict, and about the perilous road for the world economy. It was published in 2013 by Princeton University. So he's a known bear on China. He's based, obviously, in China. So it'll be very interesting to get his view and perspective of the reforms which have happened in the last 1-2 years, and whether he believes in them and whether he thinks that China actually is finally coming out of all the concerns which we have had on China in the last 3 years. So welcome, Professor Pettis. Sitting next to Professor Pettis is Hideo Hayakawa. Hayakawa-san is also a very distinguished central banker. He joins Bank of Japan in 1977 and had led a very distinguished career there, including as the Director General of Statistics and Research Department. He has worked with both the current and the previous central bank governors. So it will be, again, very insightful to get his view on it, and especially given that in Japan, for us, in the last 4 years, has been a main topic, starting with 2012 when Abe-san came here as a keynote speaker before he assumed leadership. And people who were here and listened to him, it was very clear that he had a very strong economic reform agenda. So welcome, Hayakawa-san. Last but not the least is Dr. Subbarao. Dr. Subbarao, again, is a very distinguished central banker. He started his he started his career in 1972 as an Indian Administrative Service. He actually topped that exam in 1972, which is obviously very competitive, and worked through the different Andhra Pradesh with the state ministry levels and then at the central level as well. He was a lead economist at the World Bank during the 90s till 2001. He was in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council from 2001 to 2007 and became the finance secretary at the central government in 2007. And then he was chosen to be the central bank governor of RBI, Reserve Bank of India, from 2008. So from 2008 to 2013, he was leading RBI. Again, what has happened in the last 12 months with the elections and the focus on India, it will be very interesting to see his perspective onto that. We want to make this session very, very interactive. So I'll encourage you to send specific questions if you have. But first, please join me in welcoming all the speakers. Okay, let me start by President Barroso directly. Two questions on the EU. I think the first one is the structural reforms. As a perception, the perception is the EU doesn't move quickly. It's slow to move, and the structural reforms which are required are not done, and therefore it's missing the boat, right? And it's dragging the global growth down as well. So if you can focus on that. And the second one, the bullish argument is that because of quantitative easing, the economic growth is coming through. Do you think a 2% plus type of economic growth is feasible this year or not?
So first of all, thank you very much. Our most distinguished moderator told me that you are here, you have really group of experts, but sometimes that you have difficulties in understanding Europe. I want to reassure you that also in Europe sometimes we have difficulty understanding Europe. So please don't be sad about it. Europe is complex because we are today 28 countries, and in the Euro area 19 countries. So we are today more countries in the Euro area than we were in 2004 when you mentioned so kindly when I became president of the Commission. And why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because we have to look at the trend and not just to the photography of the day. Indeed, I believe European Union has shown its resilience and the Euro area has shown its remarkable resilience. But we are not a country. We are not like the United States of America or China or India or Brazil. We are a very complex system. And so, yes, very often it is, as you were suggesting, muddling through. It's incremental. It's step by step. But I really believe, and now I'm no longer in a public office, so my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. So I really believe that the situation in Europe is improving. And reform is the name of the game. The countries that had to go through an adjustment program, they made remarkable efforts, from Ireland to Portugal, my own country, Spain, they also had a program for the banks. Greece is indeed a difficult point, and we can, if you wish, come back to that point more in detail. But not only those countries, the other countries have been making reforms in terms of labor market, in terms of retirement age, in terms of more flexible product markets. But there are things we have to address collectively. For instance, the digital market. While there is a full functioning and a very efficient market for goods in Europe, there is not yet a full digital market. So we have 28 digital markets. This is something that the Commission and the governments are now looking at. Energy and digital, two important sectors to watch closely in the future. But I believe the reforms are going on. Of course, Typically, people express doubts about Italy and France. And it's true that those big economies have been slower than others in adapting. Having said this, it's also fair to recognize the efforts. For instance, in Italy, there was a totemic change of one very important article in the legislation for labor, and so I think Prime Minister Renzi deserves credit for that. And even in France, some of the taboos are falling, like the issue of, for instance, shopping malls open during the weekends. It may seem a small thing, but it's important because it's the model, the economic model that is being now discussed in France. And let me tell that in France, people are, the establishment and the people in general are perfectly aware of the concerns in terms of the increasing divergence with Germany. Germany becoming, of course, more and more influential because of the big power that Germany is. So I believe that with this, with quantitative easing, but even before quantitative easing, but also with the support given by a relatively low euro, by the price of oil, I believe this is going to be a good year for Europe. There are geopolitical risks, major risk being certainly the behavior of Russia with Ukraine. By the way, much more harmful for Russia than for Europe so far in economic terms, but nobody knows really where is the landing zone, what Mr. Putin wants at the end. And this is a factor of uncertainty that is projecting some clouds of anxiety in some parts of the European Union, namely in the eastern countries, from Poland to the Baltic countries. And also, of course, we have some political risks because there is the rise of some extremists in some of our countries. I personally believe that the mainstream parties are strong enough to resist to that. Yesterday's elections in France were good from that point of view. There was also a regional election yesterday or the day before yesterday, to be more precise, in Spain, also good from that point of view. So I believe the system, and now I'm speaking on experience, is resilient enough. So not spectacular, but incrementally, it produces results. And I think this pattern is going to continue. And I really believe it's the best pattern for Europe because Europe, it's a different model, let's say, from the United States. This is what in Europe we call social market economy. The Europeans do not want a dramatic change from one day to the other. They want to keep the basic elements of their model, but they are aware that it needs to change progressively. And now I think most people in Europe understood, namely at the government level, the lessons of the last crisis, that indeed it is not with very high levels of debt, public or private debt, that we can do it. That is not sustainable. So let's go back to the fundamentals. Let's have a healthy growth. 2% will be good. 2%, I believe it will be good this year. The ECB and the Commission and others have been revising their forecasts upwards. So probably next year we can go even above, 2016, above 2%. But yes, some questions mark remain. But overall, I am confident about the future of Europe, and there's a way also for investment.
Professor, if I can ask you about Greece, just quickly, right? So does Greece pose an existential issue to Europe, like what we saw in 2012, number one? Number two is that what timelines do you see for this to clarify a little bit more?
Just yesterday, there was a meeting between Chancellor Merkel of Germany and Prime Minister Tsipras of Greece in Berlin. Apparently, things were not yet solved. As I have predicted, by the way, some of you were in those meetings, this thing is going to take more time than expected. Also because of the lack of experience of this new government in Greece. And people have to understand one thing, that sometimes I think some analysts outside Europe do not consider sufficiently. Yes, there is a risk if there is a default with Greece. But there is also a very big risk if the euro area appears now to respect its own rules because there is a change in the government. So there were decisions taken unanimously by the member states of the euro area. 19 countries took decisions. I don't think it's fair that one government, because there was a change, changes all those. Of course, the others have to listen to that government, and I personally am advising them to listen to Greece, to try to find some accommodation, some typical European compromise. Nobody is going to be completely happy. So some accommodation should be found, and I believe it's still possible. But I believe it will not be good that today the euro area gives the impression, okay, there is a change in the government and we change everything and the commitments are no longer to be respected. That's why the initial demands of the Greek government are not going to be accepted. I'm sure about it, completely sure. So the question is where that compromise can be found. I believe it can be found. But even if, that was your question, if I understood correctly, even if that compromise is not going to be found, I personally believe, but it's a matter of judgment, I have to be honest about it, that the systemic threats that existed before to the euro are no longer there. Because meanwhile, we have done a lot of things. We have created the banking union in Europe. Now the ECB and the EBA, we have direct control over the national government, national banks. There is today a much more solid system of support for countries in need with European stability mechanisms, 700 billion euros, so almost to $1 trillion. And also we have today the situation in those countries. Look at Ireland or Spain or Portugal. They are borrowing at better conditions than the United States today. So confidence came back. But of course, what happens if one country leaves the euro? It's not good, and we don't like it, and we are trying to avoid it. But there are also some intermediate situations before leaving the euro. For instance, control of capitals, as we have done, by the way, with Cyprus. Cyprus was in that situation some time ago. So there are some intermediate situations. But basically, I really believe that even in the worst case scenario for Greece, which I hope will not happen, the euro area is strong enough, resilient enough to overcome that difficulty.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the U.S. Mr. Fisher, so what happened? What's your take? What happened last week at the FOMC?
You had a great dinner for me.
Yeah. So, and what's your take on where the thought process right now is? And you know, your namesake, actually, last night, I think Stanley Fischer actually said that he doesn't see interest rates rise till the end of the year.
Right.
We'll appreciate your thoughts.
Well, first, it's great to be next to a great political leader, a magnificent thinker, and two other central bankers. The best description of a central bank I've read recently is in a book called How to Speak Money. And it compares us central bankers to some kind of combination between Hogwarts, the Death Star, and Ebenezer Scrooge. So I mention that because there is so much emphasis placed on what central banks will do. And even in your survey, you could see, will there be monetary tightening? We're in a state of repair in the United States. Ben Bernanke's job, and the committee that served with him, and I was one of them, was to save the economy from total implosion. Now we have a different gearing, which is the exit. We built our balance sheet to $4.5 trillion. We have $2.5 trillion in excess reserves, meaning this is money waiting to be put to work. And just to put this in perspective, for those of you that aren't familiar with the numbers, given the amount of liquidity in the United States and given the fact that that's only for depository institutions, take that money and multiply it by 5. That's how much liquidity is floating around the US system. The real issue now is, when do we begin the process of normalizing monetary policy? And it is naturally a difficult thing to do because one doesn't want to go back to force us to examine the zero bound and take any possible risk that we might slip backwards rather than advance the economy. The economy, adjusted for those who participate in the workforce, this is the best recovery we've had since the 1980s. Despite the graph you may have seen recently in the Wall Street Journal, you have to adjust for those that are willing to participate in the economy. So we're moving forward. We've had very good employment numbers. Unemployment has come down significantly. There is a debate about what a natural rate of unemployment might be amongst the committee. But I would expect the committee to continue to struggle with the issue of what is the right time to begin the process of going from uber accommodation to still great accommodation. And what we're talking about is basically the base rate. We twisted the yield curve. Now foreign income flows are depressing rates even further. These are the lowest rates in over 239 years of US history. It's an amazing statistic when you think about it. The 10-year yield is below or around 2%. The 30-year is trading at abnormally low levels. And we anchor the yield curve, but we also affect the yield curve by virtue of our securities purchases. I think it's easy for you to understand. people will be extremely cautious. There is a dimension, though, that I think needs to be explained, which is this question of inflation. There are two types of inflation, those that are a function of a collapse in demand, which we do not see, and those that are a function of an increase in supply. We have, as a country, been the net beneficiary of the drop in oil prices. Now, you mentioned you had 19 countries. As a Texan, I would say we have 2 in the United States. There's Texas and there's the rest of the United States. 39% of the operating wells in the United States are in my Federal Reserve District. 37% in Texas, the other 2 in the other 2 adjoining states. So we will be negatively affected as having been the biggest job creators in the United States, that region of the United States. For example, in 2009, we created 100% of all the private sector jobs created in one state in the United States. We will slow down, but the rest of the United States will come up by virtue of this massive tax cut we've had. This is a positive force, not a negative force. So I think there's too much of a fixation on this 2% number, which was Ben Bernanke's committee's legacy. I was part of supporting that. This is an intermediate term goal. If you look at the University of Michigan consumer surveys and you look at market expectations, even though the 5-year forward and other instruments have come off somewhat, they're still forecasting an inflation rate 5 years or 10 years out in the 1.7 to 2% range. So what the committee looks at is expectations on the inflation front. And yet, just to summarize, there will be a shyness about not repeating the errors of 1937, which Benjamin Strong did. We felt we were coming out of the recession back then, or the Great Depression. And the New York Fed in those days played a major role. Right now, that role is being challenged, as you know, significantly. Setting that aside, we don't want to repeat that error. And so there'll be a natural reluctance. My view is that this is a very large ship that we drive. We are the central bank of the world, with all due respect to Europe and the ECB. We're in a different position you are. People are keying off of us. Monetary policy acts with a lag. I consider us to be steering a gigantic monetary tanker through the seas. Mm-hmm. And before you reach your docking point, you begin to slow down, miles out at sea. And I think it's very important for us to start thinking about, and the reason I was considered a hawk is, first of all, because doves are part of the pigeon family, and I don't want to be a pigeon. But the reason I was considered a hawk was because it's important to begin slowing this ship of accommodation down well ahead of your target. I believe the markets can accommodate this. I believe it's been discounted. The question is June, September, December, whatever it may be. But I think it's been fairly well discounted by the market. And I want to remind you what Stanley Fischer, my misspelled namesake, would say, because he has a C in his name. It is a matter of going from hyper or uber accommodation to still being highly accommodative. And I don't think it should be the earth-shattering event that people expect it to be, but we could talk more about that later.
Okay, great. Professor Pettis, China, you're obviously a bear, and you've talked about the disbalances between the infrastructure investment versus the rest. And you've seen what you base there, you've seen what has happened in the last 18 months about reforms. Do you think China is finally turning around?
First, I'm not obviously a bear. In 2005, 2006, 2007, when it's sort of hard to remember now how out of control the China hype was, just like it's very hard for me to convince my students that in the late 1980s everyone knew certain things about Japan, which turned out not to be true. Back then, what I argued was that the growth model that China has followed, there's nothing new about it. There's nothing extraordinary about it. It's a growth model that we know quite well. There are dozens of countries that have had investment-driven growth miracles based on basically what I call the Gerschenkron conditions. You have to force up the savings rate by constraining the relative growth of household income. I'm still haven't regained my voice from yesterday. And you have to direct the process of investment into productive infrastructure. Many countries have done that. Many have had growth miracles. Every single one, without exception, has run into a point at which debt was growing at an unsustainable pace. Every one of those countries, once they recognized that, tried to reverse the process, found it very difficult to reverse the process. Debt continued rising, and they all had brutally difficult adjustments. So when I was saying things like that, I didn't consider myself a pessimist. I considered myself, unlike most people, Chinese or foreign, who analyze the Chinese economist as someone who had actually read a few books. There was nothing unique about it. We had seen it before. So now all of this has happened, and I find that some of my most sophisticated hedge fund clients in recent meetings have been very confused, and they said, wait a minute, you're a famous bear, but you sound like a bull. And I think, yeah, I'm a bull. I'm a bull because I think there is a reasonably good chance that China will be able to manage this adjustment in a non-disruptive way. And let me tell you how rare that is. There have been dozens and dozens of cases of these types of investment-driven growth miracles. Some people say China is an exception because nobody has grown more than China over 40 years in history. And I'll tell you again, you have to read some books. It's not true. Argentina, in the 4 decades before World War I, grew faster than China did. Turned out not to be a great story either. The point is that if China is able to manage this adjustment in a non-disruptive way, that will be an extraordinary feat, an extraordinary accomplishment by Xi Jinping, and something that he should be really remembered for. But what does a successful adjustment mean? Well, we've just had Bloomberg just published a debate, the second one now between me and Eswar Prasad, a very, very smart man at Cornell University, in which he took the bull side, which is that Chinese growth, the consensus now is that Chinese medium to long-term growth will be between 6 to 7%, and he argued that that would be the case, and I argued the bear case that it wouldn't, that there's simply no way growth rates can stay at that level. I would argue that a great case scenario is that during President Xi's administration, China grows at an average of 3 to 4%, but because it has to rebalance, and there are many ways of rebalancing, but rebalancing means household income has to grow faster than GDP. If they do it right, household income will grow at 5 to 7% during that period. Now, I don't see that as a disaster. 3 to 4% growth with 5 to 7% household income growth, I think is fantastic. And if he can pull this off, that would be spectacular. And will he pull it off? It's a little bit too early to say, and we can talk a little bit about some of the conditions that are required. But what I want to stress is one thing. China has a huge amount of debt. We all know that. It's got an extraordinary amount of debt. And I was born in Spain, grew up in Spain. My mother's France. I spent a lot of time looking at Europe. And I suspect I'm going to disagree with some of the things Mr. Barroso says, because I think Europe also has that problem. And here's the point that I would make. It's a point that when I make in front of finance people or in front of my hedge fund clients, they always say, yeah, so what? We didn't pay you to tell us that because we already knew it. But when I make it in front of economists who are not followers of Hyman Minsky, they find this very, very hard to believe. Let me make the 2 points. First of all, in finance theory, we have a pretty well formulated concept of financial distress. And what the concept says is that when debt levels have reached a certain level where they begin to distort a series of incentives, growth becomes impossible. You cannot possibly grow once debt levels have reached a certain level where the amount of uncertainty about the resolution of debt is high enough to change the behavior of stakeholders. That's pretty well understood. We have a well-formulated framework. We've never really applied that to macroeconomics. And in fact, I did a little bit in my 2001 book, and my next book, which is going to be terribly boring, is going to be all about that, an attempt to force debt into macroeconomic theory. The second fact that I would ask you to note is I'm a finance history junkie. I've read everything. And There have been many, many cases, depending on how you count it, 30 to 60 cases in the last century of countries that have had debt problems, by which I mean debt levels were high enough that you started to talk about the inability to pay. You started to see all of the transformations take place with highly indebted countries. And I cannot find, and by the way, in every single case, we've been told we have a liquidity problem. Give us time, roll over the debt, give us a few years. We're going to impose reforms. And once these reforms kick in, we will start to grow our way out of debt. What were the reforms? Every reform you can think of. I can find countries that had Marxist reforms, Friedmanite reforms, import substitution reforms. Whatever economic theory you believe in, I can find you a country that reformed along those lines. I cannot find a single country that was able to grow its way out of debt. In every single case, either implicit or explicit debt forgiveness had to take place before growth started. And I think that's not a coincidence. In every individual country, we say, well, policymakers did not impose the reforms forcefully enough. They chickened out. They're inefficient, blah, 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 blah. Maybe. But it happened in every single country. So we have to assume that none of these countries had good policymakers, or there is something about debt that prevents growth. And I would argue, as you can probably guess very strongly, it's the latter. In which case, to me, the big difficulty that China has is that debt levels are high enough that the difference between successful implementation of the reforms and unsuccessful implementation of the reforms is whether China collapses or whether China does not collapse. It has a successful adjustment at much slower growth rates. And we can I think,
if I can ask you that question, because you, at the start, you said that they will be able to manage it in a non-disruptive way. Why do you believe in that?
There's a history. We have to think about, and I discussed this yesterday, so I hope I'm not boring people who were there yesterday, but China didn't have a single growth model. There's no such thing as a Beijing consensus. That was always really stupid. What happened was that in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping engaged in what I would call a set of liberalizing reforms. We've seen many cases of countries engage in liberalizing reforms. It's always very difficult, and it's always politically very difficult. It's politically very difficult because liberalizing reforms, almost by definition, mean eliminating the ability of the existing elites to constrain growth while extracting rent. And Deng Xiaoping was ferociously opposed, but he was able to impose the reforms anyway. Power was very heavily centralized. He had the support of the military. And I think the fact that he was able to do that guarantees him a place in history as one of the great economic policymakers of all times. But it's tough to do. Following the reforms of the 1980s, China embarked on the classical Gershon-Krohn investment-driven growth model. And I would say the second stage of China's growth was that model where it was successful. The third stage of Chinese growth, and I am a huge fan of Albert Hirschman, who is not read in the context of China, and he should be, because Hirschman talked about how successful policies change the conditions that made them successful, in which case you should shift the policies, because those same policies can start to become wealth destroying. And his big complaint was, damn it, nobody ever does. They always wait too long. Why? And his solution, which I think is probably correct, is because those successful policies built an elite that benefited from those policies. In China, we have a name for that elite. We call them, in the last 7 years, we've been calling them the vested interests. And it takes a while before finally things get bad enough that you're forced to reform. So now we're on the fourth stage, which is very much like the first stage. President Xi has to impose liberalizing reforms on China, which means he's going to be ferociously opposed, and we all know that he is. And what we do know is that historically, if we looked at cases of countries that have imposed liberalizing reforms, there were studies done by Asimoglu and Robinson at the beginning of the last decade that are particularly good. And what they found is two things. One, the bad news, most of them fail in the sense that they always result in political disruption, whether it's Russia or Latin America in the 80s, et cetera. Number two, the successful cases tended to come on either end of the political spectrum. Highly competitive political systems, democracies, and there may be Roosevelt in the 1930s is a classic example. And Roosevelt was ferociously opposed. And by the way, during that period, Washington power was heavily centralized. The power of ordinary people, workers, farmers, it had been decentralized. And the guys who got killed were state power and the large New York banks and the monopolies. So someone gets killed in that process, and I think that's useful to think about when we think about China. The other types of successful reforms tend to be way on the other end of the spectrum, which are highly centralized authoritarian systems, and like Deng Xiaoping in China. And so the prediction was, in my class, my central bank seminar at Peking University in 2009 made this prediction. The next president is going to have to centralize power tremendously because democracy probably isn't an option. And if he doesn't do so, it's not going to be successful. And there are a lot of reasons for Westerners in particular to be very uncomfortable with what President Xi is doing, and maybe some of those reasons are correct. But what I would submit is that without that centralization of power, it is impossible to impose the reforms. How do I know? Because in 2007, Premier Wen announced in his famous 4 speech, unbalanced, unequal, uncoordinated, and unsustainable, that Beijing knew what the problem was, and he promised us he would resolve the problem. China would rebalance. But for the next 5 years, the imbalances got worse and worse and worse. It's hard to do it, but Xi Jinping may be able to do it.
So you think he's going to be successful?
Nobody wants to make 100% predictions. I would say 2 chances out of 3. He's been following the script so closely that we laid out many years ago that I think he could do it. But I think we need another year before we can say with some confidence that it's working.
Okay. I think if you're looking at 3 to 4% GDP growth, people may think that you're a bear. So yes. Because it's like
the consensus is 6 to 7.
6, 7, right? So
can I say just one last thing? Right. There have been many, many cases of investment-driven growth miracles, many, 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 and there have been many pessimists. And I haven't found, and I defy you to find a case where the pessimist got it right. For example, my favorite case is in Japan. Paul Krugman, the famous Japan skeptic, said the Japanese are screwed. It's going to take them 5 years before they can grow above 3%, right? 20 years of 0.5%. So it's always worse than we think. That doesn't mean it's going to do so again. I'm just warning you. The history is pretty clear. Even I'll get it wrong as a pessimist, but not because it's going to be faster, but probably because it's going to be slower.
Okay, and we'll probably come to you on Europe as well, actually. So it's, I think 3 to 4% for China, we are worried. I think if we have a 3% on Japan, we'll be excited, right? So Hayakawa-san, coming to you, actually. So it's Japan, obviously a lot of excitement in the last 3 years. I think the phase of wage growth this year, profitability coming into the corporates as well. Your take on that, where we are?
Actually, for the economy, this year is going to be a pretty good year for Japanese economy. Actually, the short slump we experienced last year itself is a little bit exaggerated. Because the front loading of demand before the consumption tax hike last year is about 0.7% of GDP. So that naturally the fiscal 13 growth is raised by 0.7. Then the growth for fiscal 14 is pushed down by 1.4% because of the level of GDP higher in 13 and lower in the 14. So we now expect the growth rate for fiscal 14 is going to be just 1% negative. So that it's mostly explained by the just front loading and reaction. And in fact, economy hit the bottom in the last August, which is even earlier than the additional easing made by the Bank of Japan. So the economy already started growth since the last summer. And the very good news for Japan is naturally the sharp decline in crude oil price. This is actually good news for most of the advanced economies, but especially in case of Japan, we are very much dependent on imported energy, even higher than the States, Europe. And also we experienced in the past 15 years or so, we saw a continuous deterioration of terms of trade. On one hand, due to the higher material prices, on the other hand, declining competitiveness in the exporting industry, especially the electronic industries. So that this deterioration of terms of trade actually pushed down purchasing power of a household, thereby pushing down the Japan's growth. But now we see a very significant improvement in terms of trade due to the lower crude oil price. And also, we saw some signs of increase, finally, in the export. The Japan's currency depreciated a lot about 2.5 years ago. And up in the past 2 years or so, we saw no significant increase in the export. That was negative surprise. But since near the end of last year, we now see some signs of increasing the export as well. So probably this year is going to be a pretty good year for a Japanese economy. But I don't think we can expect a very high growth. Now, many people expect the growth rate for fiscal 15 is going to be something like 1.5 to 2%. And 1.5 to 2% is extremely high, given the Japan's potential rate of growth. Japan's potential rate growth is very low. According to the official estimation by Cabinet Office, it's 0.6%. So that 1.5 growth is very good. Starting point is that 3.5% unemployment rate is almost full employment. Starting full employment and 1.5% growth behind the 0.6 potential rate growth, it's really good. And even 0.6% potential growth, I myself doubt it's a kind of a overestimation. Simple things to just look at.
It's all relative, right, I guess?
Real GDP level, fourth quarter last year was 1 percentage point lower than the real GDP recorded in first quarter 2008. So that during these 6 years, we don't see any increase in the level of real GDP. But we saw actually decline in unemployment rate than the...
Hayakawa-san, if I can ask you about the monetary policy, but you think the conviction stays high? Is there any thought of tapering, or should we be concerned about that, or any views on that?
Well, actually, you don't have to worry about the tapering in the coming years because, inflation rate is coming down now 0.2% year on year as of January. But I myself understand that the underlying trend is that we are heading toward 2% inflation very slowly. My just guess is that, we may see 2% inflation 2 years from now, not 2 years from the ignition of QQE, The ignition, the 2 years from ignition of QQE is just next month. It's nobody believes that inflation rate reaches 2%. But, well, certainly the inflation rate was 1.5% last April and coming down to 0.2. But, well, 1.5 is very much due to the depreciation of the yen. And the 0.2% is very much due to the decline in crude oil price, all of the external factors. But looking at wages, well, we see wages are certainly increasing very slowly. In fact, a base wage increase last year was, I think, 0.4%, very modest. So that the 0.4% against, higher CPI inflation rate, naturally real wage come down significantly. This year, probably base wage increase is going to be 0.78%. And then you can think of the next year and next. As I mentioned, the economy is going to be good. Labor market conditions is going to be further tightened toward the next year, so that it's quite likely that wage increase will be higher than 0.7%, 0.8% this year. And then, well, you can think of that, well, we are actually heading toward 2%, but the speed is much, much slower than the many people thought of. And the difficulty for the Bank of Japan is, well, what to do? Actually, they are kind of in a sort of a deadlock situation after the additional easing last October. Last October, the additional easing was kind of a 5 to 4 vote. The very, very neck and neck conditions. And many people who were against that additional easing still remain very sort of negative toward the further easing.
Okay. Okay. So it's a gradual progress, nothing,
Yep.
nothing dramatic. Okay. So we just go from a gradual to a dramatic, actually. So let's move to India.
Okay.
So it's so in the last 1 year, obviously, there's been a dramatic shift in sentiment, and obviously the way the economic reforms, the political progress has been. Dr. Subar, your view on what your assessment is, and especially on the supply side, and on India, the main issue has been the bottlenecks on the supply side. Do you think there's enough investment and focus to get rid of that, so that the inflation, which normally has been an issue on the supply side, gets taken care of in India?
So let me go from the broad to the narrow.
Sure.
You're right that there's been a remarkable turnaround in the India growth story in the last 1 year. Mm-hmm. Not so much because of what the new government has already done, but because of what the new government is expected to do in the next 4 years, 4.5 years that they have. And on several dimensions, India is in a sweet spot. On the global dimension, you look around the world, you have slow growth, low inflation, declining demographics. India is contrarian in those dynamics. You take the BRICS countries, Brazil is stagnating, Russia is contracting, South Africa is in recession, China is slowing, India is promised to grow. You take the Fragile Five, which were notorious 2 years ago. India is the only country that's made a credible adjustment in the last 2 years. On the macroeconomic dimension, growth is improving, inflation is declining, external sector is stable, the rupee is steady, public finances are under repair, and investment sentiment is positive. And importantly, on the political economy dimension, for the first time in about 30 years, we're having a government that has no coalition pressures, that is assured of 5 years in office. And also in the context of India's shifting federalism, much of the center of gravity shifting from the central government to the states, the BJP, which controls the federal government, also controls states in India, which together account for more than 50% of GDP. So that's a tremendous positive in political economy dimensions. Coming to the narrow question, not narrow, but the more specific question of supply constraints, yes. For a large economy, India stands out uniquely in the world today because while every other country is demand constrained, including China, India is supply constrained. In an economy with a per capita income of $1,500, any improvement in income quickly translates into consumption. And production has to catch up. And that's been India's problem, that there's been demand growing at a very, very rapid pace, and supply has not caught up, fueling inflation. And that's the tension that I had to contend with as governor, and that's the tension Dr. Rajan is contending with, the balance between growth and inflation. And supply constraints are endemic across board. It's not in one sector. By far the most high profile, of course, is in infrastructure. India needs to invest $1 trillion in infrastructure over the next 5 years. That translates to about 10% of GDP every year. And today, investment in infrastructure is less than 5% of GDP. So we have to double investment in infrastructure. It's not just investment per se, but we also have to get balance across sectors. One of the problems of India's investment has been that investment had taken place, but productivity of that investment has been very low because of the imbalance in across sectors. Most high-profile example is electricity generation setup, but no coal linkage. So we have to resolve those problems, not only higher investment, but higher productivity of investment. Then you talk about manufacturing. Prime Minister Modi is talking about a Make in India campaign, and that's very, very important because we took pride in India that India defied the development paradigm. Development paradigm is shifting from agriculture to industry to services. So India took pride in the fact that we defied that, leapfrogged over from agriculture to services. But evidently we're not. That's now come to catch up with us. And if you have to generate hundreds of millions of jobs, you have to invest in manufacturing. And there's talk about replicating China's export model. I don't believe in today's context India can replicate China's export model. India has to have a manufacturing revolution, but of a different kind. I believe we cannot replicate China's model because the conditions around the world have changed. China opened up at a time when global demand was growing, but today global demand is subdued, is expected to grow only modestly. There may not be deglobalization, but there's bound to be some disglobalization. So India cannot bank on global demand for its manufacturing revolution. And finally, supply constraints in agriculture. There's one of the remarkable things that's happened in India is the shift in terms of trade from the urban to the rural sector. Rural incomes had gone up by about 10% every year for the last 10 years, except in the last 2 years. That's fueled demand. But agriculture production has not caught up. It's not able to employ all those people. So you're right that India has supply constraints across board. Tremendous investment has to take place. And that's the only way we can generate growth and also maintain price stability.
I think we'll come to Rich just in a minute. Just one point. So have you seen indications that they have started to act on it?
Oh yeah, certainly, most certainly. Both in terms of governance reforms, in terms of reforms that they can do without reference to the parliament, legislative action. Also reforms that require legislative approval. They moved on all the fronts. In the first 6 months, there was concern that they're moving more slowly than expected, but this government, I think, has a game plan for 5 years. They know they're there, and they're going to play out in a more calculated, deliberate manner.
Okay. Richard, you have a point?
I was just thinking, listening to all the panelists, Churchill had a great saying. He said, in finance, everything that's agreeable is unsound, and everything that is sound is disagreeable. If you listen from the Prime Minister and the President down this panel, the real focus is on structural reform.
That's right.
And if you listen to any central banker, whether it be Janet Yellen or you listen to Mario Draghi, what we've been saying is we cannot count on what is really the most agreeable cure, which is to print money or run up debt. We need to focus on what is disagreeable and the hardest thing, which is structural change. The two countries, and right now it's on the come with Prime Minister Modi. Take an example like Mexico, which is now 75% manufacturing driven. They went through the intermediate steps such as you. Probably one of the most successful transformations of all time. No one here thinks about Mexico, even though it has a substantial population mass, great demographics, they like to breed, and at the same time has transformed because of political leadership that nobody expected, and then strengthens the epicenter of our growth because it's our most important southern neighbor and has 140 million people. But I think that's the real issue. The real issue is structural change. Yeah. And can it be accomplished without so overburdened with debt that it in effect eats its own child? I think those seem to be the key issues that come out of this discussion as I listen to it. And I must say, I'm not sure that the Macron plan of just opening 5 more Sundays for retail stores per year is a structural change.
Want to respond? You want to respond to that?
He's a nice guy, by the way.
Neither am I convinced of that. The question, but you have to look at the politics. We are here discussing policies,
yes.
But let's think realistically. The conditions of political decision. What I shared with you was that the French establishment, from the right to the left, they are completely aware of the problems of competitiveness, namely with Germany. This is very important because the European Union was built after the Second World War based on the reconciliation between France and Germany. And if this pair, if this group does not fit together, you may have problems. Sometimes the other countries complain because it was when there was, probably some of you have heard, the Merkozy, so everything was decided between Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel. But the reality is, and that's my experience, if France and Germany do not agree, at least in the euro area, there is a risk of paralysis. So that's why what's happening in France is critically important. France is the only country in Europe, as I usually say, that is at the same time north and south. It's a central country. Germany is north, Italy is south, but France is north and south. Now, intellectually, and the French are completely aware of the need of the reform. And I agree completely with you. The name of the game is reform. Even in France today, the name of the game is reform. But the pace of reform and the capacity to do it is different across countries because of the so-called vested interest. It's not only in China that people speak about vested interest. This is an expression that is used in France for at least 50, 60 years, which Michel Crozier was already speaking about it. La société bloquée, the blocked society, because of the resistance to change. And what I said was that it was so difficult. In fact, the government had to have a kind of executive order because there was not a majority for this change. It is a taboo that is being broken. So I don't want to exaggerate the impact of that reform. I did not pretend to do it. But it is an important step that it should be encouraged. I think this, now speaking politically, I'm not from the same political, let's say, party that is now in France, leading France. I'm not. I'm from a center-right position. But I think we should encourage those reforms in France because some taboos have been broken, like in Italy with this change in the employment and in the employment legislation. By the way, it's interesting that there are governments of the left that are doing what the governments of the right were not able to do.
In Germany.
And sometimes it's paradoxical. Because if it was a right-wing government doing what happened today in Italy, I can tell you it will be much more difficult than being done by, let's call it, left-wing government. So it's true that the resistance to reform in France is higher than what we have seen, for instance, in Spain or in Portugal or in Ireland. Even Greece has made important reforms. People tend to forget that, but they are uneven. The new member states have been impressive in some of the reforms they have been doing, namely Poland and other countries. We don't speak about them because they are relatively small countries, but the Baltic countries, Latvia went through a program that was at least as demanding as Greece, and now they are growing. I mean, Ireland is growing spectacularly. So this shows that those austerity policies are not killing growth, as some people are suggesting. This is not true. Countries that went through the most difficult adjustment are now among those that are growing the most in Europe. They are growing more than Germany. By the way, Ireland is growing more than Germany. The exception being Greece. But generally speaking, I think the name of the game today in Europe is reform, structural reform. People are aware that they need to increase productivity. At the end, it's about productivity. And in fact, if you look at the figures now globally, Europe has a surplus in everything except energy and raw materials. And the surplus of Europe are growing in goods, services, and even in agriculture, agro-industry. So that's why I believe the fundamentals of Europe are not so bad as analysts were saying. And I remember during the most difficult moments of the financial crisis when I had to convince some of my partners, from the United States president to the Russian president. By the way, I cannot forget when President Putin, in June 2012, with a smile in his lips, asked me, José Manuel, do you think I should sell my euros? Because he said 20% of my reserves are in euros. I think it will be better for him to opt for his rubles. So my point is that Europe may have problems, but systemically is more stable than others. I had to receive, we Europeans, we had to receive, now I'm going to be very candid. I have to,
Please,
can I do?
Please be.
Can you imagine it was for some Europeans like myself, and Chancellor Merkel, and Prime Minister Cameron, and President Sarkozy and Hollande, and the President of Italy, Prime Minister of Italy, to be, okay, listening to good advice from President Obama for 5 minutes, the Chinese president for 5 minutes, and to listen to 45 minutes of advice from the president of Argentina. And that's what we went through. So at that point, it was not credible to say, as we were saying, we are going to get out of it. The existential crisis of the euro is going to be behind us. It will take time. It will be muddling through. It will be adaptation. But I really believe what I'm telling you now. Really, I think systemically, Europe has resources. Now, if you ask me, and so following your comment that I thank you, is a structural reform strong enough? Not really. We have to do more, not only nationally, but collectively, as I mentioned. We have an internal market for goods, but we don't have yet a digital internal market or energy internal market. The same day I have signed, as President of the Commission, an infringement procedure against Greece because of resistance of dismantling some barriers to the internal market, I've signed against Germany. Because Germany, in fact, in terms of the internal market, is still very protective. There are some sectors, if you are a Spanish company, you cannot go in some sectors still today in Germany. So what Germany has to do is also to increase the demand, aggregate demand in Europe, opening the internal market for service. What we should not do, and there I completely disagree of some advice given, for instance, from some American professors or American analysts, is to do an expansionary stimulus to the economy. To say that for Italy, to think that it's through an expansionary stimulus that they are going to do better, it's completely wrong. What Italy has to do is to reduce excessive expenditure, namely in the state sector, to become more flexible. That's what Italy has to do. And I believe the other policies are going to the right direction. I think the ECB has taken the right decisions. But once again, the ECB and my good friend Mario Draghi, the ECB is an independent institution. But it's an independent institution that works in a system. And in fact, you are right. When we invited Mario Draghi to come to the European Council, to our European summits, the first thing he was pushing was for structural reform. And without the commitment to structural reform, they will not be able to take the famous statement, whatever it takes. By the way, it reproduces the conclusions of the European Council just before that, or recently the quantitative easing measures. Quantitative easing measures that I believe are having a positive effect, namely in terms of the value of the euro, and that was our concern. We had a problem with the value of the euro, and I think this has been addressed now. And so that's why, basically, I agree with most of you that in the first vote, you were quite confident about the next future of Europe.
Thank you. We'll open it to questions. You can send it us electronically, or we'll have mics here as well. While we think about that, let me ask a question, President Barroso, if I may actually, and then I think Michael has a question as well. The two countries, France, do you think, from your personal interactions, do you think there is political conviction to change, to structural reforms, number one? And number two, if I may ask the second one as well, UK, you just want to highlight on that. That obviously is very topical, whether they're going to stay within the EU or not, and your assessment on that.
First question, I think the French know it. I know François Hollande, present, I spoke about that with him several times. He's completely aware. Now, are they going to do it or not? I really don't know. I have to be honest, we don't know. The resistance to change, the vested interest in some sectors in France, some corporations, it's huge. And so I really don't know if they are going to be successful or not, and that's my honest answer. On the second issue about Britain, I hope Britain will stay in the European Union. I think, I have no doubts that Prime Minister Cameron wants that to happen. His strategy is clear. In case he wins the election, he will make a referendum. So what is his strategy? It's quite clear. He wants to negotiate a kind of a new an agreement with the other partners and to say to the British people, look, I've got a good deal, so let's vote for it. This strategy has some risks, because to negotiate is going to be tough. And so it's difficult. At the same time that you are negotiating in a tough position, you are praising your partners, saying good things about Europe. So, and a referendum is, by definition, dangerous. Now, having said this, the other partners of UK want Britain very much to stay, namely Germany. So there are no doubts about it. France as well. So if the British government comes with some realistic demands, I believe it's feasible. And in fact, there has already been some change in the rhetoric of the British Conservative Party. They started by speaking about freedom of movement. That cannot be in question, because the European Union is based on 4 freedoms: freedom of movement of goods, of capital, of services, and of people. Without freedom of movement of people, we cannot have a real internal market. It will be a disaster. It will never be accepted by the others. Not only by the new members like Poland or others that will be considered there is a discrimination among Europe, but Germany, for instance, cannot let Polish down. So to present as a condition for a revision of the treaties a fundamental revision of freedom of movement inside Europe is a no way. To present as a condition to revise some of the so-called social benefits, what in Europe people call social tourism, is that some people going from poorer countries go to the richest ones to get benefits. Because the benefits, for instance, the welfare benefits in Europe are incredibly high. You can have people in unemployment receiving the minimum salary for 1 year and 2 years. And the minimum salary in some of our countries is more than $1,000 or even almost $2,000 per month. That explains why some countries can live in Europe, and my friends outside of Europe sometimes are very surprised. How is it possible to live with these levels of unemployment? Look, they prefer to be unemployed in Europe than to go back to Latin America. Like in Spain, many of them are, in fact, from Central America. And what they earn as unemployed people is much more that they will be gaining if they were employed in their countries. So that's why we have to look at this country by country in a more sophisticated analysis and avoid simplistic generalizations. So I really believe that this is for the British is important, and I hope, and I'm quite confident that UK will remain a very important member of the European Union.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Mike, you have a question for President Barroso?
Well, it wasn't so much a question. I was also going to make a speech. I'll try to keep it short. I wanted to suggest that as I see it, the global problem that we have, and I'm not saying anything very surprising here, is a lack of demand. And The demand problem is driven, I think, by excess savings. And I think there are two sources of the excess savings. One, which is quite new, we haven't seen this before, but we see it especially in China and to a lesser extent in Germany. And that is that there were policies that repress the growth of household income, so that in China, household income is 50% of GDP. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And that's important because most consumption is household consumption. So if household income is low, total consumption is low, so therefore savings are very high. Nothing to do with the thriftiness of the Chinese people or the German people, but rather with the structurally very low household income share. And then the other big thing we have is, as we all know, significant income inequality. And for me, the problem of income inequality has always been a savings problem. In a very unequal society, rich save more than the poor, so you tend to have very, very high savings. So the problem is what to do with all of this excess savings. Europe is exporting as much of it as it can, world record amounts of exports. How do I know? Because they're running a current account surplus. China is competing with Europe to see who can export the most amount of excess savings into the world. I suspect we're going to see more in Japan and other places. Now, so where does that go? Where do all those excess savings go? Well, so far we've been pretty lucky. Well, some of us have been pretty lucky. If you're not Brazilian or Peruvian or Chilean or Australian, you've been quite lucky, because a lot of that excess savings, a lot of those current account surpluses were absorbed by the collapse in the surpluses of the commodity producers. And you said earlier, no one saw that coming. I'm sorry, some people did see that coming. In 2011, 2012, I remember going to Australia, Brazil, and saying, within 3 to 5 years, iron, copper, they're all going to drop by more than 50%. And I love the Australians are great. They all came up to me after my speech to congratulate me, not on how smart I was, but on how brave I was, which they really value, so I thought it was great. But they've absorbed a lot of that current account surplus. But I don't know how much more they can absorb, because iron has gone from 190 to whatever, 66. Even if it goes to zero, right, they still can't absorb as much as they have in the past 3 years. Copper has lost 50% of its value, oil has lost I don't know what, but there isn't much more room for those countries to absorb that, these very high surpluses and exports and savings. So my worry is that, so who's left? Well, we know who's left. It's always the same country, well, two countries, but UK is too small to matter. It's the US. So I would assume that the adjustment is a rising US current account deficit, and the worry there is that that makes Americans anti-trade, and if Americans become anti-trade, I think we truly have a global problem. So how else can we resolve this? Historically, we've seen this before many times. Income inequality has happened many times before. They usually lead to exactly the same kinds of crises that we have currently. But there are times when they do quite well. And I would argue that in the middle of the 19th century, we had tremendous income inequality, and England was exporting huge amounts of savings. But there was a place for it to go, and that was the United States. The United States, like most developing countries, had insufficient savings for its investment needs. So the US imported British savings and grew British and Dutch and grew very rapidly. So that was a good version. But usually it's very difficult to find a place to place all of those excess savings. We need credible countries that have huge investment needs. And there are not that many. We know countries that have investment needs, but they're not credible. China doesn't export its savings to Africa or even India, and I hope that changes with India. It exports it to the United States. Same thing with Europe. So how do we resolve this? In the past, we've been very worried about developing countries that absorb foreign savings, because we know that that leads to debt crises. It's always led to debt crises, and this was the problem that Gerschenkron faced and said, that's why it's important for developing countries to force up their own savings rates. But it didn't happen in the US. We had plenty of crises in the US, but money flowed into the US. It was able to absorb all of these excess savings. And I think the big difference between the US absorption of foreign money and the 20th century absorption of foreign money, especially after World War II, which almost always led to crises, was that in the case of the US, the absorption was in the form of equity, whereas in the last 50, 60 years, it's always been in the form of debt. And that creates a huge difference in terms of the volatility of growth. So what I would argue is, for example, India. I believe India has huge infrastructure needs, and I believe it's reaching the point where it's becoming credible enough that it can become the United States of the 21st century, the huge absorber of all of this excess savings. But the question for me is whether Indians politically will allow money to come in the form of equity, or whether that becomes, from a nationalistic point of view, too difficult. Because if that were to happen, I suspect we could start resolving some of the big demand problems that we have. The other resolution, of course, is a redistribution of wealth downwards, which I don't need to tell you is politically very
Let's
difficult.
ask Dr. Suba if you want to have a comment, and then we'll come back to Mr. Fisher as well.
That was basically it.
Good question.
Professor Perez talked about India's investment needs. Certainly, investment needs are huge. And he was talking about whether India is accepting equity as distinct from debt. In fact, the impression I have is, first, I think, contrary to the stereotype view, India is more open than most people acknowledge, both on the debt side and on the equity side. And I believe India is more open on the equity side than on the debt side. We're not a capital account convertible economy. The capital account is not open. There are some restrictions, but the restrictions are much fewer on the equity side than on the debt side. Whenever India's had problems of capital inflows or outflows, the levers have been used on the debt side, not on the equity side. And foreigners enjoy almost equal benefits as residents, as equity investors. It is true that certain sectors have been restricted for foreign investment, foreign direct investment, but I believe every country has restrictions. Even the United States, you have perhaps the most open economy in the world, but even they have restrictions on certain sectors not being open to foreign investment. India's restrictions are more talked about because of India's investment needs and the promise that India has for potential investors. I think the question specifically is about Chinese equity coming into India.
I think it was a more generic comment. But if I can ask one more question actually to you, Dr. Suba, given that your 40 years experience in the Indian government, do you think this government can you see the highest conviction to push through? Because I think the risk with India right now actually is that expectations are really high. People actually are quite bullish, and whether they actually get realized or not. So whether we actually are disappointed on very high expectations, and given your experience, and normally it's the civil service which needs to execute, you think there is enough of a structure and push at the political level to get it executed?
I think so, because you're right that India has oftentimes failed in the past and punched much below its weight. Today there is an opportunity. As I said, India is in a sweet spot. The government is quite strong, quite determined, and there's enormous pressure on the government to perform and deliver results, because it's no longer the 70s or 80s when low-income households did not have a voice, could not influence electoral outcomes. Today, India is a much more mature, much more dynamic democracy, and it's incumbent, the government will feel the pressure. Not so much because it's more determined or less determined than previous governments, but because of democratic pressures to perform and deliver results. What India has seen over the last 30 years is that poor people do not want doles. They don't want subsidies. They want improvement. They want increase in opportunities to improve their livelihoods. And I think this government understands. But when you talk about government in India, you also have to understand that India has several layers of government. It's not just the central government. It's the state governments which matter. In fact, investors who have experience in India will vouch for this, that as much as you have to negotiate and deal with the central government bureaucracy, you have to deal with and negotiate with state government bureaucracies even more. So structural reforms, governance reforms at the state level are going to be increasingly important in India. And that's why I said that we are uniquely positioned, because there is a strong central government with a robust majority, and that central government also controls states in terms of political parties being in office, which together account for more than 50% of GDP. So I believe that the dynamics of delivery of growth, development, poverty reduction, opportunities in India are going to be much better.
Right. I should do a plug here, actually. Our Indian strategist has been writing a lot on this importance of the state governments, actually, and how they are much more effective than the central government. If you haven't looked at it, please look at that research. Richard, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to say, before he was prime minister, Modi was a good example of what you can do in your state. Right?
That's right. In fact, I think Mr. Modi thought that he can replicate Gujarat at the national level. He was chief minister,
right,
presumably acknowledged to be a very effective chief minister, and he campaigned on mainstreaming the Gujarat model. Now as prime minister, he will perhaps find that at a higher level is less able to influence action at the ground level than he was as the chief minister. So I think India's future and prospects are going to be dependent on how chief ministers and elected and civil service at sub-state level perform. And that's one of the dynamics that's happening, that I believe increasingly we're going to see in India competition across states to invite investment, not so much by giving them tax sops or giving them subsidies, but by giving them a better investment climate. You know, we've done several polls of investors. What investors want, of course, if you give them tax sops, they want it. If you give them free power or free water, they'll take it. But what they want more importantly than that is law and order. They want clean governance. They don't want inspectors to come to their factories and take bribes. They want the government not to interfere in the labor situation. And I think we're going to see all these things happen in India, and those dynamics are going to originate at the state level.
What I wanted to comment on with regard to our professor, one of the sectors that worries me the most, and you didn't discuss, we have $2 trillion in emerging market debt. It's been an explosive debt market. To me, that and the US CCC rated credit markets, if you look at the spreads, are abnormally low. So that's comment number one. Secondly, your comment on trade protectionism, this is something that we go through in every second term of every single president of the United States. We had two great liberalizers after Grover Cleveland. None of you know who Grover Cleveland was.
I know.
That's right. Same age as you. One was George H.W. Bush, the other was Bill Clinton. Most of the agenda has been accomplished. But we always are, there's fearful we'll turn to protectionism. It always falls on the second-term president to make for liberalization moves. Whether we get PPE or not, much of the agenda has been accomplished. I can't see us turning backwards. And then the third comment I would make, excuse me again, I love the fact, the way you describe France as being part north and part south. To me, that is a description of schizophrenia. But they do say schizophrenia beats dining alone. No wonder the French have such good food. Anyway.
Look, I'm not here to defend France. Even if I love France, but let me put things right. In spite of all the difficulties of France, France is one of the biggest recipients of investment in the world today. And that's important to understand how the European Union works. The United States invest more in Belgium, that has 10 million people, than in all China. Let's look at the facts and the figures. But of course, it's not in Belgium they invest. They invest in the European Union.
Through Belgium.
And the United States invests 4 times more in the Netherlands, that's 16 million people, or 17, than in China. And of course, it's not the Netherlands, it's also France and Germany. It's the market. So this is why, in European terms, we have to get used to this diversity. This diversity is part of the game. I've been dealing with it in permanent crisis mode the last 10 years. So really, I mean, if there is someone who sometimes was frustrated by the slow commitment to reforms, I can tell you it was me. But please don't underestimate the capacity of the Europeans to reform. It's not going to be spectacular, but it's going that direction. But I want to come in a point that you've made, and I very much agree, is the issue of trade. As you know, trade, Doha development, so-called Doha round failed, not because of Europe, but once again. In fact, two major players were not ready. It was the United States and India. They were not ready. That's basically why we did not have the Doha agreement. Europe and China were ready, basically, for it. And then we have launched at European level a big program of bilateral agreements. And in fact, we have concluded, I was proud to conclude many of those agreements with Singapore, with Canada most recently. I had the honor to launch with President Obama the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And I really would like to see in the United States that commitment in terms of trade. So what's going to happen now with TPP is critically important. And I really hope that President Obama puts as one of the most important points of his legacy, concluding these trade agreements. I think it's critically important for the world. Because with all the problems that we have in Europe, by far the most important economic trade and investment relationship today is still the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. And so if we conclude it successfully, it can be a good signal for the global economy. And that is something that, for instance, in Europe, the Italian, for instance, industry wants that. It's quite interesting because they were not so enthusiastic, to be honest, about an agreement with Japan. But by the way, something that we also relaunched now with Premier Abe. We have relaunched this agreement. So when we speak about where growth is going to come from, I believe that we have still a lot to do in terms of trade. We are in the right direction, but we should do more in terms of trade. And I hope that the commitment on Europe on one side, now I'm speaking for Europe, but also the American, what President Obama can do until the end of this second mandate is critically important for the overall, let's say, confidence of markets and confidence in the global economy.
We had last couple of minutes. Any question from the floor? We have one question here. Oh, there's a question there. Let's take that. He was closer to the mic, actually.
I want to go actually back to your question to about Japan, Mr. Hayakawa, about the interest rate structure in Japan. If inflation gets up to 1.5% or 2% in several years' time, how do you see the interest rate structure in Japan?
Well, actually, when inflation rate actually reaches 2%, when naturally we expect the Bank of Japan somehow start tapering, stop purchasing JGB, and finally raise the rate. It's just actually Fed is going to do right now. But well, right now, Japan's long-term rates remain 0.3, 0.4%, mainly due to the massive purchase by Bank of Japan. Bank of Japan purchased 10 trillion yen JGB each month. Well, so that if Bank of Japan stop purchasing, then we have to worry about abrupt rise in long-term rates. And well, even the rise to say to 3% is extremely high in Japan's history in the past 20, 25 years. 2-3% long-term rate is just usual, even lower in the States. But 2-3% is extremely high. And it's going to be very dangerous thinking about Japan's government debt to GDP ratios is more than 200%. And Japan's government still continues rather large primary budget deficit, contrary to Greece.
Right.
So that, well, good news is that, well, probably it takes at least 2 more years to achieve 2%. There's some time. And government have to make more credible commitment toward the fiscal consolidation before actually the 2% inflation be achieved.
Okay, great. Just one last question.
This is a question for Mr. Fisher. the Fed funds forward curve has for some time reflected a different reality than the data points that come from the Fed members. And I've asked a lot of people why they think that is. The best reason I've heard is that we live in a more global monetary policy regime, and given all the excess dollars that have been created in the world that have been borrowed, that to go on the path that the Fed members project would create such distortions that it would actually slow global growth even more, and so therefore that curve actually never happens. And the only way you can get that curve is if you had real global growth, where then all interest rates would go up. Do you believe in that argument, or do you have your own, what would your belief be as why is there such a big difference?
I think there's some reality to the argument. First of all, the dot charts are best guesses. And I actually gave a speech called parroting Dr. Seuss' out, damn dot. Because the way it effectively works, the 12 banks have their own models. We have a central model for all the 7 or 6 or 5 governors we presently have. And it's, in the end, judgmental. And you'll watch how they change over time. It's affected by short-term considerations. So the markets are not perfect, but they are implicitly pricing in a global responsibility. And I often think of Janet Yellen as a small woman, more like Atlas with the world on top of her shoulders. We have to take into account the consequences of our action, but we're not governed by them. Neither is the Bank of England or the Bank of Japan or the Reserve Bank of Australia, or et cetera, because they're also subject to national parliaments. And this is a tug and fro. So the markets are assuming correctly interest rates and money is totally globalized. And just to give you a historical reference point, I'll talk about this tomorrow. When Wolford wrote his great book on interest rates, not once did he mention globalization. When Friedman wrote the book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, there's not a single mention of financial markets. If you had done a search in 2005 on the internet of globalization and interest rates, you know how many hits you would have gotten? 2. Now you'll get billions. So I think markets are ahead of the way conventional economists think. But at the same time, you have to take into account the reality that central banks are creations of their diets, their parliaments, and their congresses. And there are limits to how much they can take international considerations into account. Sophisticated financial operators don't think that way, but the reality is the ECB still has to answer to, in the end, to political authorities, as does the Federal Reserve Bank, as does the Bank of Japan, as does the Bank of England, and so on. Right. This is where I think the difference comes from.
That's true.
Great. I must thank all the panelists. I think we have run out of time, but again, these panelists have their own sessions as well. They've either done it or they are going to do it. Richard actually is on tomorrow morning. It's available on the web as well. If you want to have more detail, please do so. Let me thank them and join us in thanking all the panelists. Thank you.